She came when the light was leaving, as if even the sun couldn't bear to witness what shame looked like when it learned to walk. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in a cloud of ochre dust, and Evangeline Mercer stepped down into Redemption Flats with nothing but a threadbare carpetbag and the weight of a past that clung to her shoulders like a burial shroud. The Arizona territory stretched wide and merciless around her, all burnt sienna earth and skeletal mesquite, a landscape that promised neither forgiveness nor shelter. She kept her eyes down, studying the warped planks of the boardwalk as boots shuffled away from her approach. The town smelled of wood smoke and horse sweat, of lye soap and something sweeter, fresh bread perhaps from the bakery whose door swung shut just as she passed. Inside, a woman's face appeared briefly in the window, mouth pressed into a thin line of judgment before the curtain fell. Evangeline knew that look. Had learned its vocabulary in a dozen towns before this one, in the painted rooms of Tombstone where men bought what they called love and women sold what little they had left. She'd fled that life 3 days ago with bruises still yellowing on her ribs, running from a man whose idea of possession included his fists. The madam had called her ungrateful. The mirror had called her ruined. Now Redemption Flats called her nothing at all, just watched with the collective silence of the righteous as she walked its single dusty street. The boarding house stood 2 stories tall, its windows glowing amber in the dying light. Evangeline climbed the steps, each footfall deliberate, and knocked. The woman who answered had steel-gray hair pulled so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows in permanent surprise. Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard, the shopkeeper, had called her when Evangeline asked directions. "I'm looking for a room," Evangeline said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I can pay weekly and I'm clean and quiet." Mrs. Pritchard's gaze traveled from Evangeline's scuffed boots to her faded calico dress, lingering on the exposed collarbone where her shawl had slipped. Recognition dawned, not of Evangeline herself, but of what she represented. The older woman's face hardened into something ancient and unforgiving. "We don't harbor your kind here." The door slammed with enough force to rattle the frame. Evangeline stood motionless, counting her heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Shame wasn't loud, she'd learned. It was the silence between pulses, the empty space where your name used to be. She turned and descended the stairs with her spine straight, though something inside her bent and bent. The general store refused her coin. The saloon keeper laughed when she asked about work washing glasses. By the time twilight deepened into true dark, Evangeline found herself behind the livery stable, standing before a lean-to that leaned more than it stood. The structure listed to one side like a drunk seeking a wall, its roof patched with mismatched boards that would let the stars through. But it was shelter. It was something. She spread her blanket on the dirt floor and unpacked her life. A dented tin cup, a Bible with pressed wildflowers marking psalms, a daguerreotype of a sister she'd never see again. Her hands shook as she arranged these artifacts of a person she used to be before Tombstone, before the crimson rooms and grasping hands, before she learned that survival sometimes meant swallowing pieces of your soul until you weren't sure what remained. Through the gaps in the wall, she could see the livery owner had left a lantern burning. Tobias Granger, someone had called him, a man with kind eyes and careful movements. Whether the light was mercy or mere oversight, she chose to believe the former. Small graces were still grace. Evangeline wrapped herself in her blanket and whispered a prayer, not for salvation but for invisibility. For the gift of passing through the world without leaving marks or taking them. The desert wind carried the distant sound of a piano from the saloon, laughter that belonged to people who still remembered how. She closed her eyes and tried to remember that feeling, joy untainted by transaction, belonging that didn't cost blood or dignity. She didn't hear the footsteps in the alley. Didn't know that someone stood in the darkness beyond her broken shelter, watching this quiet tragedy unfold with a jaw clenched tight and eyes that had seen too much suffering to ignore one more measure of it. Caleb Thorne had come to town for supplies and stayed for a whiskey, nothing more. He'd heard the whispers in the general store, crude speculation about the woman who'd arrived on the evening stage, the kind of talk that made him sick with its casual cruelty. He'd finished his drink and walked out, intending to ride home to Broken Creek Ranch and forget the small meannesses of small-minded people. But then he'd seen her, this slip of a woman with her head held high despite the doors slamming in her face. Watched her walk through the gauntlet of judgment with a dignity that spoke of practice, of a dignity earned through repeated humiliation. And when she'd settled into that pathetic lean-to as if it were a palace, arranging her few possessions with such tender care, something in his chest had cracked open. He gripped his hat in calloused hands, studying the shadowed form through the gaps in the wood. 3 years since Mary Catherine died, 3 years of going through motions and calling it living. He'd forgotten what it meant to witness someone else's pain and feel it as your own. Had almost convinced himself that numbness was a kind of peace. Caleb turned away from the lean-to but carried her image with him. That careful arrangement of broken things, that prayer whispered to an indifferent sky. Some men measured strength in gunpowder and how fast they could clear leather. Caleb Thorne had learned to measure it differently, in what a person could endure and still choose kindness, in the grace required to keep your humanity when the world demanded you surrender it. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would return and he would offer what he could, not charity which wounded but opportunity which healed. Tonight, though, he mounted his horse and rode toward home beneath a sky scattered with stars that watched everything and judged nothing, while behind him in the lean-to, Evangeline Mercer dreamed of a life where shame didn't follow her like a shadow, where someone might speak her name and mean it as benediction rather than curse. Dawn arrived without mercy, all harsh light and the smell of hay dust. Evangeline woke to voices, the livery owner and another man arguing just beyond the splintered boards of her shelter. She sat up carefully, muscles aching from the hard ground, and listened to Tobias Granger explain that he couldn't have that woman sleeping on his property, not with a business to run and a reputation to maintain. Folks are already talking, he said, voice tight with apology and fear. I got daughters to think about. Evangeline stood, smoothing her dress though the wrinkles had become permanent geography. She gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency, the muscle memory of someone who'd learned to pack a life in under 3 minutes, and stepped into the morning glare. Tobias flinched when he saw her, guilt written across his weathered face in lines deep as arroyos. I'll work, she said simply. Mucking stalls, mending tack, whatever you need. Just today. Then I'll move on. Tobias opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish drowning in air. His reluctance was palpable, town pressure warring against practical need and something that might have been conscience. Before he could refuse, boot falls announced another arrival. Caleb Thorne materialized from the street's amber dust, leading a bay mare with a white blaze. Morning, Tobias, he said, voice carrying the texture of creek stones, smooth but substantial. Came to check on my horses. He didn't look at Evangeline directly, didn't acknowledge her presence with word or gesture, but she felt the weight of his awareness nonetheless. There was something deliberate in his positioning, the way he angled himself between her and Tobias, creating space without demanding it. Actually, Caleb continued, examining the mare's hoof with exaggerated attention, I've been meaning to ask around. My housekeeper quit last month, couldn't take the isolation I suppose. Broken Creek's 3 miles out, and I've got a crew of men who can rope cattle but can't cook worth a damn. You wouldn't know anyone looking for honest work, would you? The question hung in the desert air, crystalline and careful. Tobias glanced between Caleb and Evangeline, understanding dawning slow as sunrise. He nodded once, relieved to have the decision lifted from his shoulders, and mumbled something about checking on a customer before retreating into the stable's shadowed interior. Evangeline remained motionless, studying this man who'd manufactured an escape route while maintaining her dignity. Caleb Thorne looked to be in his late 40s, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into too many sunrises. His hands were scarred and capable, his shoulders broad beneath a work shirt that had seen better years. But it was his careful distance that struck her most, the way he offered rescue without forcing connection, creating opportunity without demanding gratitude. What's the price? She asked, voice low. Men don't offer kindness for free. I learned that lesson thoroughly. Finally he looked at her. His eyes were the color of creek water over stones, gray-green and surprisingly gentle. Just honest work, ma'am. Cooking, mending, keeping house. Wages are fair, cabins private and yours alone. I don't concern myself with where folks come from, only where they're going. And where am I going? The question emerged sharper than intended, edged with all the accumulated bitterness of doors slammed and coins refused. That's for you to decide. He lowered the mare's hoof, straightened. But seems to me you could use a place to do the deciding from. Somewhere you're not spending all your strength just staying alive. Evangeline felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking but opening like ice surrendering to spring. She wanted to ask what he expected in return, wanted to catalog all the ways men had made her pay for their so-called generosity. But his face held only patient waiting, no hunger or calculation. Just an offer extended across the distance between them like a bridge built from possibility. I accept, she whispered. Within the hour, she sat beside him on a wagon bench, her carpetbag at her feet, watching Redemption Flats recede into dust and distance. A young man rode alongside, Jesse Whitmore, Caleb had introduced him, a ranch hand with sun-bleached hair and a smile that came easy. Jesse attempted conversation, speaking of the ranch and the cattle, of how Mr. Thorne's late wife had loved the wildflowers that turned the prairie into a quilt each spring. Evangeline listened without responding, too aware of the stares that followed their passage through town. Sarah Mae Tucker, the baker's daughter, stepped deliberately into their path before moving aside at the last moment, her face twisted with contempt. Someone threw a stone that pinged off the wagon's side, and Evangeline flinched hard enough that her shoulder struck Caleb's arm. He didn't acknowledge the impact, didn't turn toward the coward who'd thrown the stone or offer empty reassurances. He simply adjusted the reins and maintained their steady pace, as if hatred were nothing more than weather to be endured. There was strength in that steadiness, in the refusal to grant cruelty more attention than it deserved. They traveled west beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at, the sun climbing hot and relentless. Caleb offered her a canteen without comment, and she drank, tasting iron and minerals and something like hope. The landscape opened before them, endless sweeps of sage and ocotillo, mountains purple in the distance. The land so vast it made her feel both infinitely small and strangely significant, as if even broken things had a place in all that immensity. When Broken Creek Ranch finally appeared, modest buildings clustered beneath a stand of cottonwoods, a windmill turning lazy circles against the sky, Evangeline felt her breath catch. Not because it was grand, but because it looked like home might look if home were a place that welcomed instead of expelled, sheltered instead of exposed. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand brief and impersonal at her elbow, and led her to a small cabin set apart from the main house. Inside, a bed with quilts the color of sunset, a window facing the mountains, a table where someone had placed a jar of wildflowers, their petals still holding morning dew. He didn't mention them, didn't draw attention to the gesture, just said that supper was at sundown if she was hungry, no obligation, and left her standing in the doorway of a room that smelled of soap and possibility. Evangeline crossed to the table and touched the flowers with trembling fingers, purple lupin and Indian paintbrush, delicate as promises. She sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, not from despair but from the terrifying, exquisite sensation of being seen as human. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like blessing, and somewhere in the distance, a man who'd given her shelter without asking for her soul went about the business of living, as if kindness were simply what people did, as if grace were ordinary as breathing. The weeks unfurled like petals, each day revealing some new tenderness Evangeline hadn't known she could still feel. She woke before dawn to cook for the ranch hands, biscuits that rose golden and tender, beans seasoned with cumin and wild onion, coffee strong enough to raise the dead. The men ate with a reverence that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the care she poured into each meal, the way she remembered Jesse preferred his eggs scrambled, how Dutch took his coffee black as midnight, how Samuel Grey Wolf wouldn't touch pork but loved her cornbread with honey. They treated her with a careful respect that felt like rain after drought. Dutch, gruff as weathered bark, left firewood stacked by her cabin door without comment. Jesse taught her to ride properly, his instructions patient as he adjusted her posture in the saddle, never once letting his hands linger or his eyes wander. Samuel shared stories by the evening fire, tales of his Navajo mother and the grandmother who taught him that healing came in many forms, not all of them medicine. But it was Caleb's presence that remade her, molecule by molecule. He moved through the ranch with quiet authority, speaking more through gesture than words, and in his silence she found a kind of peace she'd forgotten existed. He never asked about Tombstone or the bruises that had faded from her ribs. Never pressed for confessions or demanded gratitude. He simply existed beside her, a steady presence like the mountains on the horizon, ancient and unmovable and somehow protective in their permanence. She began to soften in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch. She started humming while kneading bread, old hymns her mother had sung before the fever took her. She caught herself laughing at Jesse's terrible jokes, the sound rusty but real. At night, she slept without nightmares, waking to birdsong instead of the phantom weight of unwanted hands. But Redemption Flats wouldn't let her forget. The monthly supply trip arrived like a reckoning, and Evangeline insisted on accompanying Caleb despite the knot of dread in her stomach. She wouldn't hide forever, wouldn't let fear make her invisible. The general store smelled of pickle brine and leather, sunlight slanting through windows filmed with dust. Ezra Hollins stood behind the counter, his expression souring the moment Evangeline crossed the threshold. Other customers, Vernon Pritchard, the boarding house owner's husband, and two women whose names she didn't know, stopped their conversations mid-sentence to stare. We need flour, sugar, coffee, Caleb said evenly, placing his list on the scarred wooden counter. And whatever Miss Mercer requires. Ezra's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. I don't serve her kind. The words hung in the air, ugly and familiar. Evangeline felt the old shame creeping back, drawing her spine rigid, pulling her eyes downward. But before she could retreat, Vernon Pritchard spoke up, voice dripping with theatrical concern. Caleb, you're a respected man. Why would you tarnish yourself associating with a whore? We all know what she is, what she's done. You've bought yourself a painted lady and dressed her up like decent folk. The crude laughter that followed felt like fists. Evangeline's vision tunneled, her breath coming shallow and quick. She started to turn to flee, but Caleb's voice stopped her, not raised, not angry, just absolutely certain. Miss Mercer is my employee and under my protection. He spoke with the weight of stone settling into earth. You'll treat her with the respect due any working woman, or I'll take my business, and I'll make sure others take theirs, to Silver Junction. 20 miles ain't so far when a man values his conscience over convenience. The silence that followed was profound. Ezra's face cycled through shock, calculation, and finally resignation. Broken Creek Ranch accounted for a substantial portion of his income, and Caleb Thorne's word carried influence that extended far beyond his property lines. Men respected him not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it through years of fair dealing and quiet integrity. I meant no offense, Ezra muttered, already reaching for the flour. Yes, you did. Caleb's correction was gentle but unyielding. But you'll swallow it now and learn to do better. That's what decent folks do when they've been small, they grow. Vernon opened his mouth to protest, but the look Caleb gave him could have frozen whiskey. The boarding house owner shut up and studied his boots with sudden fascination. Outside, Evangeline's hands shook as she helped load supplies into the wagon. The afternoon sun felt too bright, the air too thin. Caleb worked beside her without speaking, his movements deliberate and calm, until finally everything was secured and they stood in the wagon's shadow, dust motes dancing between them like captured light. You called me Miss Mercer? She said, voice barely audible. And there. You gave me back my name. It's your name. Never stopped being yours no matter what they tried to make you believe. Something broke open in her chest, not shattering but blooming. All her life she'd been nobody's daughter, nobody's sister, nobody worth naming except as inventory or insult. But Caleb spoke her surname like it meant something, like she was someone deserving of formality and respect, someone who existed beyond the sum of her survival. That evening, they sat on the ranch house porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of plum and copper. For the first time, Evangeline spoke about Tombstone, not the details that would make her small again, but the broader strokes. The madam who'd promised safety and delivered servitude. The patron whose obsession had worn the mask of devotion until it slipped, revealing violence underneath. The morning she'd run with nothing but terror and the slim hope that somewhere, somehow, she might find a place that didn't require her to bleed for belonging. Caleb listened without interruption, his face profiled against the dying light. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars emerge like punctuation marks in the darkening manuscript of sky. My Mary Catherine was an outcast too, he said finally. Daughter of a Kiowa woman and Irish trader, rejected by both communities for being neither and both. I loved her fierce and true, and I learned something in those years, that a person's worth isn't determined by others' small-mindedness. It's determined by how they move through the world when the world gives them every reason to surrender. He turned to look at her then, and Evangeline saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not pity but recognition. He saw her strength, the steel core that had kept her alive through everything designed to break her. You survived what would destroy most people, Evangeline. Her first name in his mouth was reverence. That's not shame. That's steel forged in fire hot enough to purify. The way he said her full name, Evangeline, all 4 syllables pronounced with care, made her feel like a person instead of a problem, like someone with a history that extended beyond her scars. She'd been Eve, Evie, girl, whore, that woman, anything but the name her dying mother had chosen, meaning bearer of good news, believer in possibility. Say it again, she whispered. Evangeline. He smiled, slight and genuine. It suits you. Sounds like morning breaking, like something beginning instead of ending. They sat in companionable silence as night deepened, and when their hands brushed on the weathered wood between them, neither pulled away. The touch was brief, tentative, but it carried the weight of promises neither was ready to speak aloud. The slow accumulation of moments that built something stronger than declaration, more enduring than words. In the distance, A coyote called to the rising moon, and Evangeline realized with sudden, startling clarity that she was no longer running. She was here, rooted in red earth and possibility, learning what it meant to stay. 3 months into her new life, Evangeline woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee drifting from the main house. A morning like any other, except for the way the air felt charged, electric, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. She dressed and crossed the yard, noting how the ranch hands moved with unusual tension, their voices low and urgent near the barn. Dutch saw her and looked away too quickly, guilt written across his weathered face in lines deep as canyons. Jesse met her at the porch steps, his young face pale beneath its permanent sunburn. "Miss Evangeline, there's something you need to know." A man rode into Redemption Flats yesterday asking questions. Flashing money around, making promises. He's looking for someone, a woman who ran from Tombstone 3 months back. The world tilted sideways. Evangeline gripped the porch rail, splinters biting into her palm, anchoring her to the present even as the past rushed up like flood water. She didn't need to hear the name to know. Rance Holloway. The patron who'd mistaken possession for love, whose hands had left bruises in the shape of ownership, whose rage at her departure would have festered into obsession during her absence. "He called you his property," Jesse continued, voice tight with barely contained anger. "Said he'd paid good money and you'd stolen yourself away. Said he was here to retrieve what belonged to him." Evangeline's legs threatened to buckle. The shame she'd slowly shed over these months came flooding back, drowning her in its familiar suffocation. She saw herself through Rance's eyes, merchandise, inventory, a thing to be reclaimed like a stolen horse or misplaced saddle. All the progress she'd made, all the personhood she'd reclaimed, suddenly felt fragile as spider silk. "I have to leave." The words emerged flat, decisive. "I won't bring this to your doorstep. Won't let him destroy what Caleb's built here, what you've all given me." She turned toward her cabin, already calculating how far she could get before Rance found her trail, but a voice stopped her cold. "You're not running anymore, Evangeline." Caleb stood in the doorway, backlit by the kitchen's warm glow, and something in his stance, feet planted, shoulders square, spoke of immovability. He crossed the porch in 3 strides and took her shoulders gently but firmly, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This is your home. You belong here. And I'll be damned if I let some bastard with a fat wallet and a mean streak chase you back into hiding. You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand perfectly." Caleb's voice was granite wrapped in velvet. "I understand that running worked once, but it won't work forever. Eventually, you have to stand your ground, and this ground is as much yours as mine." Within the hour, the ranch hands gathered in the main room, Dutch, Jesse, and Samuel Gray Wolf forming a semicircle of quiet support. Caleb explained the situation with brutal honesty, giving them the choice to leave, to distance themselves from whatever storm was coming. None of them moved. "I rode with Mary Catherine's people when the cavalry came hunting them for sport," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of old wars. "I know what it means to protect family. Miss Evangeline is family now." Dutch cracked his knuckles, face set in grim determination. Man who thinks he can own a person needs to be reminded what century he's living in. But Caleb shook his head, and Evangeline saw something strategic flickering behind his eyes, not the hot rage of violence, but the cold calculation of someone who understood that force wasn't the only form of power. "We're not going to beat him with fists or bullets. We're going to beat him with witnesses." He left the ranch that afternoon, riding into Redemption Flats with purpose carved into every line of his body. Evangeline watched him go with her heart in her throat, terrified that he'd return changed, that Rance's corruption would somehow taint the goodness that made Caleb who he was. But she didn't know where he went, didn't know about the visits he made throughout the town. To Otto Fisk the blacksmith, whose daughter Caleb had pulled from a burning barn during a prairie fire 2 years back. To Eleanor Marsh, the widow whose mortgage Caleb had paid anonymously when drought killed her husband's crops. To Dr. Benjamin Hartwell, who owed Caleb for the medical supplies he'd provided during the diphtheria outbreak that nearly wiped out half the town's children. One by one, Caleb called in the quiet debts of kindness, not demanding, never demanding, but simply asking, "A good woman is being threatened by a bad man. I'm asking you to stand witness to her truth." He returned after sunset, saying nothing about where he'd been, and Evangeline didn't press. That night, she lay in her cabin staring at the ceiling beams, watching shadows dance in lamplight and trying to imagine a future that didn't involve running. Trying to believe that standing still was an option when every instinct screamed for flight. The next morning, Rance Holloway arrived at Broken Creek Ranch with 2 hired guns flanking him like bookends of violence. He was exactly as Evangeline remembered, handsome in a way that concealed cruelty, dressed in expensive clothes that announced his wealth, eyes cold as a snake's belly. He sat astride a black stallion, surveying the ranch with the entitled gaze of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. "I've come for my property," he announced, voice carrying across the yard with theatrical authority. But what he found wasn't an isolated ranch, it was a gathering. Caleb stood on the porch with his ranch hands, but behind them and around them stood a dozen townspeople. Dr. Hartwell with his medical bag. Otto Fisk still wearing his leather smithing apron. Eleanor Marsh with her 3 children. Even Ezra Hollins from the general store, looking uncomfortable but present nonetheless. And at the center of them all, stepping forward with her spine straight and her head high, came Evangeline. She dressed in her best calico, the blue one that Caleb said matched her eyes, and she moved with a dignity that 3 months of being seen as human had restored to her bones. "I am not your property, Rance Holloway." Her voice didn't shake, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I am not merchandise to be retrieved or livestock to be reclaimed. I am Evangeline Mercer, and these people," she gestured to the assembly behind her, "they see me for who I am, not who you tried to make me." Rance's face purpled with rage, but before he could speak, Dr. Hartwell stepped forward. "I've treated this woman for injuries, broken ribs, contusions consistent with repeated beatings. Would you like me to testify to that in a court of law?" "She's been helping with the sick," Eleanor Marsh added, voice gaining strength. "Tended to my youngest through fever, asked for nothing in return. That's the character of a healer, not a criminal." One by one they spoke, these people who judged her, rejected her, slammed doors in her face. They offered testimonies not of perfection, but of redemption witnessed, of humanity recognized. And in their words, Evangeline heard her own transformation reflected back. The person she'd become when someone finally gave her space to be more than her scars. The sheriff, summoned by the commotion, arrived with his hand on his pistol. He was a coward and everyone knew it, but even cowards responded to public pressure and the weight of witnesses. He looked at Rance, at his hired guns, at the assembly of respectable citizens standing in defense of a former prostitute, and made his calculation. "Mr. Holloway, seems to me there's no crime been committed here except harassment. I suggest you and your associates move along before I have to arrest someone for disturbing the peace." Rance's face contorted with impotent fury. He'd expected an easy retrieval, expected shame and isolation to have kept Evangeline vulnerable. He hadn't counted on community, on the stubborn human capacity to choose grace over judgment when given the chance. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his horse was already turning, his hired guns already backing away from the unified front before them. Evangeline watched him ride away, getting smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She'd stood her ground. She'd spoken her truth. And the world hadn't ended, it had expanded, making room for her to exist fully, completely, without apology. Caleb's hand found hers, his grip warm and solid and real. "You did that," he murmured. "Not me, not them. You." And standing there in the yard of Broken Creek Ranch, surrounded by imperfect people who'd chosen to do better, Evangeline finally understood that redemption wasn't something granted by others, it was something you claimed for yourself, syllable by syllable, sunrise by sunrise, until the person you'd been forced to be finally surrendered to the person you'd always had the right to become. 1 week after Rance's departure, Evangeline woke to a world that felt fundamentally different, as if the very air had been redistilled into something purer. She dressed in the blue calico Caleb had given her, not as payment but as gift, because he'd said the color matched her eyes and made her look like morning itself. The fabric whispered against her skin as she walked to the main house, where Dawn painted the porch boards gold and Caleb sat with 2 cups of coffee, waiting. "I wondered if you'd come," he said, voice rough with something that might have been hope or fear or both tangled together. "I'm done wondering." She took the cup he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "About a lot of things." They sat side by side, watching the sun climb over the distant mountains, and the silence between them held no discomfort, just the deep quiet of 2 people learning to exist in the same space without armor. Finally, Evangeline spoke the question that had kept her awake through the night's small hours. "Why did you do it? Risk everything, your reputation, your safety, your standing, for someone like me?" Caleb turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his creekstone eyes made her breath catch. "Because I see you, Evangeline. Not your past, not what others decided you were, you. And what I see is strength that could move mountains, grace that survived being twisted into something ugly, and a heart that still knows kindness after every reason to choose bitterness. Her throat tightened with tears that felt holy somehow, cleansing rather than shameful. "I'd like to stay. Not as your housekeeper, though I'll gladly keep doing the work, but as someone who might build a life here. As someone who's stopped running. I'd like nothing more." His hand found hers, calloused palm against calloused palm, survivors recognizing each other's scars. "I'd like a great deal more if I'm being honest, but we've got time to figure out what that looks like." Sunday arrived with church bells that rang across the sage flats like invitations or warnings, depending on who heard them. Evangeline stood before the mirror in her cabin, smoothing her dress and trying to quiet the thunder of her heartbeat. Caleb had offered to accompany her, but she'd refused. This was something she needed to do alone, needed to walk through the door of her own volition rather than sheltered behind his shadow. The church stood white and simple against the enormous sky, its steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation or a prayer. Evangeline climbed the steps with her spine straight, remembering what Caleb had said, that her worth wasn't determined by their judgment but by how she moved through the world when the world gave her every reason to surrender. The murmur of conversation died when she entered. Every head turned, every eye assessed, and she felt the familiar flush of shame start to rise before she forced it down. She was Evangeline Mercer, and she'd earned her name through fire and survival and the choice to keep choosing life even when death would have been simpler. Then Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard stood from her front pew, the same woman who'd slammed the boarding house door in Evangeline's face all those months ago. For a terrible moment, Evangeline braced for another rejection, another public humiliation. But Mrs. Pritchard's face held something different now, recognition of her own capacity for cruelty, and the courage required to correct it. "Miss Mercer," she said, voice carrying through the sanctuary, "would you do me the honor of sitting with my family?" The gesture rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. One by one, people stood, not all of them. Vernon Pritchard remained seated with his arms crossed and his face set in permanent disapproval, but enough to matter. Sarah May Tucker approached with tears streaming down her young face, words tumbling out in a rush of apology for her cruelty, for her thoughtless participation in suffering she didn't understand. Evangeline took the girl's hands in hers, felt their trembling, and spoke the truth that had taken her months to learn. "We're all just trying to find our way back to grace. The path looks different for everyone, but the destination's the same, learning to see each other as human instead of convenient categories." After the service, Reverend Wainwright approached with a request that stopped her heart mid-beat. Would she consider leading the Women's Charitable Society, organizing care for the sick and aid for those struggling? The former outcast, now entrusted with the community's compassion. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Evangeline, who accepted with hands that shook only slightly. That evening, Caleb asked her to ride with him. They climbed a hill overlooking Broken Creek Ranch, where the land stretched endless in every direction, the desert meeting mountains in a line so sharp it looked drawn by God's own hand. The sky burned orange and purple, colors too vivid to be real except they absolutely were. "I need to tell you something," Caleb began, and Evangeline's heart clenched with sudden fear that all of this, had been temporary, that even kindness had limits. But he continued, voice steady despite the emotion roughening its edges. "I loved Mary Catherine fierce and true. I'll never stop loving her memory, won't dishonor what we had by pretending she's been replaced. But I've learned that hearts don't have limits like we think they do. They expand. They make room." He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, the metal catching the dying light. "This was my grandmother's. Traveled all the way from Ireland to here, waiting for the right hand. Evangeline Mercer, you've made me remember what it means to live instead of just survive. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building something new together while still honoring what came before?" Evangeline couldn't speak past the joy lodged in her throat like a blessing too large to swallow. She nodded, tears streaming hot and fast, and managed finally to whisper, "Yes. 1,000 times yes." The kiss was soft and sacred, full of promise and patience and the kind of love that chose you daily rather than once. They sealed their vows there above the world that had tried to break them, with sunset as witness and wind carrying their commitment to every corner of the territory. The wedding happened on a Saturday in autumn, when the cottonwoods turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. Reverend Wainwright officiated at the ranch, and the entire town came, even those who'd once scorned her, drawn by curiosity or genuine transformation or simple human desire to witness grace in action. Evangeline wore white without apology, carried wildflowers picked that morning, and when Caleb introduced her as Mrs. Evangeline Thorne, the name settled around her shoulders like wings. The first dance happened under strings of lanterns Jesse and Dutch had hung from the cottonwood branches, and when the music started, a fiddle and guitar playing something slow and sweet, the townspeople formed a circle around them. Then, in a gesture no one had choreographed, they bowed. Not the mocking bow of servitude, but the respectful acknowledgement of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged holding light instead of ash. 2 years later, Evangeline stood on that same hilltop, visibly pregnant, with Caleb's hands resting gentle on her shoulders. She'd taken to writing in a journal, recording their story for the child growing inside her, wanting them to understand where they came from and what it cost and why it mattered. She wrote the final entry as the sun set, her handwriting growing shaky with emotion. "I came here with nothing but shame, little one. Your father gave me a name. And in that name I found not just survival but a life worth living. Remember this when the world tries to tell you who you are. We are never just our scars. We are also every sunrise we choose to witness after. Every act of courage disguised as ordinary living. Every moment we choose grace over bitterness, hope over surrender." Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple, and she leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling their child move beneath her hand like a promise kept. Below them, Broken Creek Ranch glowed in the twilight, home, sanctuary, the place where shame had learned to transmute into strength. You see, grace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It arrives in the quiet gesture of a stranger who sees you, really sees you, and chooses kindness when judgment would be easier. Evangeline Mercer became Evangeline Thorne not because a man saved her, but because someone finally offered her the space to save herself. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Not rescue but recognition. Not salvation but the simple, sacred act of being seen as worthy of the name we carry. May you find your Broken Creek. May you be brave enough to stay.